Noah Williams had only seconds to decide: stay silent and let a mistake cost an important patient's life, or risk his career by confronting his superior. In an operating room filled with tension, he realized that the truth came at a price, and that this moment would change everything. A decision that would not only save a life, but could also expose a corrupt system. The question is, how far is he willing to go?
The ER at Chicago's busiest hospital buzzed with urgency as doctors and nurses moved in controlled chaos. The overhead lights cast a harsh glow on the city councilman lying unconscious on the operating table, his life hanging by a thread. Noah Williams, a seasoned nurse with years of experience, monitored the patient's vitals, watching the numbers fluctuate dangerously. Dr. Richardson, the senior surgeon in charge, stood poised with a scalpel, his hands trembling almost imperceptibly. But Noah noticed, he always noticed. The councilman's vitals were deteriorating quickly, and time was running out. Something wasn't right. Noah's pulse quickened as he realized what Dr. Richardson was about to do. Dr. Richardson, Noah said, his voice calm but firm. His vitals are unstable. I suggest approaching the artery from a different angle. It'll reduce the risk of further damage. Dr. Richardson froze for a split second, his eyes narrowing as he glared at Noah over the surgical mask. I've got this under control, Williams, he snapped, his voice tinged with irritation. Stay in your lane. Noah's jaw tightened. This wasn't about him, it was about the patient. He looked across the operating room, searching for Emma Caldwell, the sharp, young ER doctor who had joined the team just a few months earlier. Emma's eyes met his, her expression unreadable, but he saw the flicker of agreement in her gaze. Dr. Richardson, Emma said, stepping forward. Noah's right. We need to adjust the angle. The patient's vitals, enough. Dr. Richardson cut her off, his voice cold and authoritative. I'm the one leading this surgery. If you two can't follow orders, you can leave. The room went silent, the only sound the steady beep of the heart monitor, which was speeding up. Noah could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He could stay silent, keep his head down, and let Dr. Richardson proceed, but that would almost certainly lead to the councilman's death. Or he could speak up again and risk everything, his job, his reputation, and Emma's career, too. The councilman's life was slipping away. Noah made his decision. I'm not staying silent, Noah said, stepping forward. This is about saving a life. Emma didn't hesitate. Dr. Richardson, we need to adjust the approach, now. For a moment, Noah thought Richardson would refuse again, but the senior doctor's hand wavered. He gritted his teeth, anger flashing in his eyes. Fine, he muttered through clenched teeth. Do it your way. Noah and Emma moved quickly, shifting the angle and adjusting the instruments as the heart monitor steadied. The councilman's vitals stabilized, his condition no longer critical. But the victory was short-lived. Dr. Richardson ripped off his gloves, his face flushed with rage. You're both finished here, he spat, storming out of the room without another word. The surgical team stood frozen, the tension thick in the air. Noah could already feel the weight of the consequences settling over him like a lead blanket. As the adrenaline faded, he glanced at Emma. Her face was pale, but she didn't look away. That wasn't just a procedure, she said quietly. That was a career move. Noah nodded grimly, knowing she was right. The councilman might have been saved, but both of their careers were now in jeopardy. Noah sat in the break room, staring down at his hands. The adrenaline from the surgery had worn off, but the weight of what had happened still clung to him. Dr. Richardson would waste no time filing complaints against both him and Emma. The stakes felt impossibly high. As Noah rubbed his temples, memories of his early days at the hospital flashed through his mind, moments he tried to bury, but that now resurfaced with painful clarity. Flashback: when he first arrived at the hospital, Noah had been hopeful. He was the only black male nurse in his unit, but he was confident in his abilities. He had put in the hard work, earned his position, and thought that his dedication would be enough. But it wasn't long before the microaggressions began. At first, they were subtle, offhand comments about his impressive knowledge, as if it were surprising that he knew how to do his job. He'd get passed over for prime assignments, often given the more difficult or unpleasant tasks, while his white colleagues breezed through their shifts. And then there were the assumptions, the unspoken belief that, no matter how much he proved himself, he wasn't quite at their level. "Hey, Noah, could you handle the bedpans in room 308? I've got more important things to do," a younger nurse had said to him once, tossing the request over her shoulder like it was nothing. It wasn't the task itself, but the assumption that it was his responsibility to handle the menial work that grated at him. Noah had swallowed the frustration, day after day. He couldn't afford to be seen as difficult. Black men in the medical field were already judged more harshly than their peers, and he knew he couldn't risk a single misstep. His reputation was constantly on the line. But as the months passed, the weight of those daily indignities built up. He began to see the patterns of exclusion more clearly, especially when it came to promotions. Noah had been in line for a leadership position twice, and both times, it had gone to less experienced white nurses. The excuses were always polite, always just enough to sound legitimate, but he knew what was really happening. Present-day Noah shook his head, trying to push the memories away. They were nothing compared to what he was facing now. This wasn't just about being overlooked, this was about being directly targeted. Emma walked into the break room, her expression tight. She sat down next to him, glancing at the door before speaking. "I just talked to Dr. Langston," she said in a low voice. "He's warning me to back off. He thinks I should distance myself from you and Richardson's complaint." Noah's jaw clenched. "Of course he does." Emma's face flushed with frustration. "He said if I keep pushing, I'm risking everything. My career. My future here." Noah looked at her, his chest tightening. He had been afraid of this, afraid that she'd get pulled into his fight and lose what she had worked so hard for. Emma was brilliant, one of the best doctors in the ER, but in a male-dominated field, she already had to fight to be taken seriously. The fact that she was a woman, and young, made it even harder. "I don't want you to get dragged down because of me," Noah said, his voice quiet but firm. "I can handle this. You should do what's best for your career." Emma's eyes flashed. "Noah, this isn't just your fight. What Richardson's doing isn't just about race, it's about the toxic culture in this whole hospital. It affects me, too. You're not the only one they try to silence." She took a deep breath, her expression softening. "We're in this together. I'm not backing down." Noah stared at her for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. He had always felt like he was fighting alone, but for the first time, he realized he didn't have to. "I appreciate that," Noah said, his voice thick with emotion. "But you know they'll come after you, too." Emma nodded grimly. "Let them. I'm done playing by their rules." The break room door creaked open, and one of their colleagues, Nurse Carla, poked her head in. "Dr. Richardson's called a meeting with the administration," she said quietly. "It doesn't look good." Noah exchanged a glance with Emma. The storm was coming, and there was no turning back. Noah walked into the conference room, the air thick with tension. The hospital's administration sat in a line, their faces unreadable. Dr. Richardson was there, seated at the head of the table with an air of smug satisfaction. He didn't even look in Noah's direction, but Noah could feel the weight of his disdain. Emma entered a few moments later, her shoulders squared. She gave Noah a brief nod before taking her seat. The room was eerily quiet as Dr. Langston, Emma's mentor, stood up to address the room. "The reason we're here, Dr. Langston began, his voice measured, is to discuss the incident during yesterday's surgery involving Councilman Torres. There have been concerns raised about the conduct of one of the nurses involved, and we need to determine if protocol was followed correctly." Noah clenched his fists under the table, his stomach churning. It was starting, the formal process of stripping him of everything he'd worked for. Dr. Richardson leaned forward, folding his hands in front of him with exaggerated calm. During the operation, Nurse Williams acted beyond the scope of his role, challenging my judgment in a critical moment. This put the patient at risk and showed a lack of respect for the established hierarchy of the surgical team. His actions were inappropriate, and I believe disciplinary action is necessary. Noah felt a surge of anger, but he kept his face neutral. Richardson had twisted the truth, portraying himself as the victim of Noah's supposed insubordination. Before Noah could speak, Emma stood. Her voice was steady, but Noah could see the tension in her posture. With all due respect, Dr. Richardson, that's not an accurate account of what happened. The patient's vitals were deteriorating. Noah suggested an alternative approach that I agreed with, and we followed it. It was the right decision, and the patient's life was saved because of it. Richardson's eyes narrowed. You're defending him, Dr. Caldwell? You're willing to risk your career to stand by a nurse's overreach? Emma didn't flinch. I'm standing by the truth. The room fell silent again, the tension thickening as Dr. Langston spoke up. Dr. Caldwell, are you aware that defending Nurse Williams in this matter could have serious consequences for your future here? Noah's stomach twisted as Dr. Langston's words hit Emma. He had expected the blow, but hearing it said out loud made the threat real. Emma met Dr. Langston's gaze without blinking. Yes, I'm aware. Dr. Langston leaned back in his chair, his face softening slightly. We have to consider what's best for the hospital. This isn't about taking sides, it's about maintaining the integrity of our procedures and ensuring that we operate within established guidelines. Noah had heard enough. He cleared his throat and spoke for the first time. This isn't just about guidelines, Dr. Langston. It's about a culture that values hierarchy over patient safety. I made a judgment call because I knew it was the right thing to do, and Dr. Caldwell agreed with me. The patient's life came first. I'd do it again. Dr. Richardson scoffed, shaking his head. That's the problem with you, Williams. You think you know better than those with years of experience. Noah locked eyes with Richardson. No, Dr. Richardson. I just know when a patient's life is on the line. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. The administration exchanged glances, uncertain of how to proceed. Noah could sense the weight of the decision looming, one that would define the rest of his career. Dr. Langston finally broke the silence. We'll need to deliberate. In the meantime, both Nurse Williams and Dr. Caldwell will be placed under review pending further investigation. The words hit Noah like a punch to the gut. He had known this was coming, but it still felt like the ground had shifted beneath him. He glanced at Emma, her face pale but resolute. She had put everything on the line for him, and now they were both in free fall. As they left the room, Noah exhaled slowly, the tension settling in his chest. You didn't have to do that, he said quietly to Emma once they were in the hallway. Emma shrugged, though her voice wavered. Yes, I did. They're not going to scare me into silence. Noah admired her resolve, but he knew the fight was only just beginning. Richardson wouldn't stop until they were both out of the hospital, and the administration seemed more interested in maintaining their status quo than the truth. What happens now? Emma asked, her voice softer, the uncertainty beginning to creep in. We fight, Noah replied, though even as he said it, he wondered just how far they could go against a system that had always worked to shut them down. The next morning, Noah sat at his kitchen table, staring at the laptop screen, the early morning light filtering through the blinds. He had barely slept, his mind churning over the events of the previous day. The review, Richardson's smug face, the threat hanging over Emma's head, all of it weighed heavily on him. He knew one thing for certain, if he didn't take action, Richardson would win, and he and Emma would be thrown to the wolves. But the hospital system was built to protect people like Richardson, people who thrived in the status quo, no matter who they had to step on. Noah's fingers hovered over the keyboard as he thought back to the quiet conversations he had overheard in the past few months, hints about promotions being blocked, the sidelining of nurses of color, the disproportionate scrutiny placed on minority staff. It wasn't just about Richardson. There was something bigger, a deeper corruption that needed to be exposed. He began searching through internal hospital reports, staff turnover, promotion records, anything he could find. His pulse quickened as he started to notice a pattern. There were at least 5 minority nurses, including himself, who had been passed over for leadership roles, despite being more qualified than the candidates who were chosen. Every single one of them had spotless records, yet they had been quietly pushed aside in favor of less experienced white staff. Then there were the anonymous complaints, ones that never seemed to lead to any significant investigations. Most of them were filed by or on behalf of minority staff. Suspiciously, these complaints disappeared into the void, no follow-up, no accountability. It was a paper trail of systemic discrimination, quietly hidden behind the hospital's polished facade. Noah's heart raced as he pieced it together. This wasn't just negligence. It was deliberate, coordinated, and protected by those in power. And Richardson was one of the ringleaders. As Noah scrolled through the files, something else caught his attention. A confidential memo dated 2 years earlier, discussing a special committee responsible for overseeing leadership appointments. Richardson's name appeared several times, along with a list of other high-ranking doctors, including Dr. Langston. Noah stared at the screen, the realization settling in. This committee was handpicking staff for leadership roles, making sure that only those who fit their narrow mold moved up in the ranks. And it explained everything, why his promotions had been blocked, why every time he came close, someone else was chosen. The system wasn't just broken, it was rigged. He quickly downloaded the files, knowing that this was the ammunition he needed. He couldn't just sit back and let Richardson win. He had proof now, something concrete that could turn the tide. His phone buzzed, breaking his concentration. It was Emma. "Hey," she said when he answered. Her voice sounded tired but determined. "I've been thinking, we need to get ahead of this. We can't let them control the narrative." Noah sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I know. But they're not just going after me. They're coming for both of us. Which is why we need to fight back," Emma replied. "I've been talking to a few colleagues, and some of them have seen what's been going on, but were too afraid to speak up. If we go public with this, we might be able to force the hospital's hand." Noah hesitated. Going public meant turning this into a full-blown scandal, and it would likely cost them both their jobs. But after what he had just uncovered, he knew that staying quiet wasn't an option. "I've been digging," Noah said, his voice lowering. "There's more to this than just Richardson. There's a whole network, people like Langston, Richardson, and others, who have been blocking minority staff from getting promotions. I found the records to prove it." Emma was silent for a moment, processing what he had said. "You're serious? This is bigger than just Richardson?" "Yeah. And I've got the evidence to back it up." The line went quiet again before Emma spoke, her tone more resolved than before. "Then we have to act. This is our chance to expose everything." Noah closed his eyes, weighing the risks. If they exposed the truth, they could tear down the system that had been holding them back. But it would come at a cost, one they couldn't fully predict. "I'm with you," Noah said finally. "But we have to be smart about this. We need to make sure we're protected." "I agree," Emma said. "I'll reach out to a few reporters I know. We'll need to make this as public as possible." Noah's chest tightened as he realized how quickly everything was escalating. They were about to blow the lid off the entire hospital, and there was no telling how far Richardson and his allies would go to stop them. But he also knew that if they didn't act now, nothing would change, not for them, and not for the others who had been silenced. As Noah prepared the files to send to Emma, he glanced out the window, the sun rising over the city. The fight was just beginning, and they were about to go to war with a system designed to keep them down. The tension in the hospital was palpable. Whispers followed Noah and Emma wherever they went, and the weight of impending disaster clung to them both like a storm cloud. Everyone seemed to know that something was happening, though no one dared speak openly about it. Richardson and his network had influence, and the fear of being swept into the chaos was enough to keep people silent. Noah was in the locker room, changing into his scrubs for his shift, when he overheard two nurses talking in hushed tones just around the corner. "They're saying Nurse Williams went against Richardson in surgery," one of the nurses whispered. "Yeah, and Dr. Caldwell backed him up." "Can you believe it?" the other replied. "People like that don't last long here. You don't go after someone like Richardson and walk away without consequences." Noah's hand stilled on his shirt. He had known it was bad, but hearing it laid out so bluntly sent a wave of frustration and anger through him. His entire career, all his hard work, was hanging by a thread, and for what? Because he had the nerve to speak up? As he left the locker room, he bumped into Dr. Langston in the hallway. Langston's face was tight with something between concern and annoyance. "Noah," he said quietly, motioning for him to follow into an empty office. "We need to talk." Noah entered the room cautiously, his defenses already up. Langston closed the door behind him and leaned against the desk, crossing his arms. "Look, I don't know what you think you're doing," Langston began, "but you need to understand how dangerous this game is. Richardson has a lot of pull, and if you keep pushing, you're not going to have a career left. Neither will Emma." Noah's jaw clenched, anger bubbling up beneath the surface. "I'm not playing a game, Dr. Langston. This isn't about power or influence. This is about doing the right thing." Langston sighed, rubbing his temples as if exhausted by the conversation. "Noah, I get it. I do. But you have to know when to pick your battles. Going after someone like Richardson, it's career suicide. For you, and for her." Noah's heart pounded in his chest. He had respected Langston once, but now he saw him for what he truly was, someone who had chosen self-preservation over integrity. Someone who had been complicit in the system that had oppressed people like Noah. "Is that what you've been doing this whole time?" Noah asked, his voice low but sharp. "Picking your battles by protecting people like Richardson? Blocking people like me?" Langston's face hardened. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know more than you think," Noah said, stepping forward. "I know about the committee. The one that's been quietly deciding who moves up in this hospital and who doesn't. The one that's been making sure minority staff never make it into leadership." Langston's eyes widened, just for a moment, before he quickly masked his surprise. "You don't know what you're getting into, Noah. Drop this before it's too late." Noah stared at him, the weight of the moment pressing down on his chest. This was it, the breaking point. He could walk away now, keep his head down, and maybe salvage his career. Or he could push forward, risking everything to expose the truth. "I'm not dropping it," Noah said, his voice steady. "I'm going to expose everything." Langston's expression darkened. "Then don't say I didn't warn you." Noah walked out of the office, his pulse racing. The confrontation with Langston only solidified his resolve. He couldn't turn back now, not when he was so close to blowing the lid off the corruption that had plagued the hospital for so long. As he made his way toward the nurse's station, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from Emma. "Meet me outside in 5. We need to talk." Noah slipped out of the building and found Emma waiting near the side entrance. Her face was tight with anxiety, her hands fidgeting as she paced back and forth. When she saw him, she stopped, her eyes locking onto his. "I just had a conversation with Langston," Noah said, keeping his voice low as he approached. "He knows what we're planning." Emma nodded, biting her lip. "I figured as much. It's worse than I thought, Noah. Langston isn't just protecting Richardson, he's part of the committee, too. They've been blocking us from the inside for years. And if we don't move fast, they're going to shut us down before we even get started. Noah's stomach dropped, though it wasn't entirely a surprise. Langston had been complicit from the start, just another cog in the machine. We need to make our move, Noah said, his voice firm. Now. Emma glanced around, her nervousness clear. I've reached out to a couple of reporters. They're interested in the story, but we have to go public with the evidence. We need to be prepared for the fallout. Noah nodded. The decision was made. There was no going back now. What about you? He asked. If we do this, your career, I know, Emma interrupted, her voice hard. But I'm not backing down. Not now. Noah looked at her, feeling a rush of gratitude and admiration. She was risking everything, her career, her reputation, for the truth. For him. And now, it was time to take the final step. Okay, he said. Let's do this. Noah stood outside the hospital's main entrance, the cold wind cutting through his jacket. Emma stood beside him, her breath visible in the air as she nervously tapped her phone screen, waiting for confirmation from the reporters. The city skyline loomed in the distance, its towers standing tall and indifferent to the chaos about to unfold inside the hospital. They're here, Emma said quietly, her voice steady despite the tension etched across her face. Noah nodded, his heart racing as he watched two reporters approach the entrance, cameras in tow. This was it. There would be no turning back. As they walked through the hospital doors, Emma sent a quick text to the colleague she had quietly allied with, someone who had also witnessed enough corruption to finally step forward. The plan was in motion. The administrative board meeting was set to begin in less than 30 minutes. This was their only window to present the evidence, to expose everything before the hospital could try to bury the story. The reporters would act as a safeguard, a public witness to ensure that the truth couldn't be easily swept under the rug. As they approached the boardroom, the tension between Noah and Emma felt electric. They exchanged a glance, one last moment of silent acknowledgement that this could cost them everything. But it was the right thing to do. When they entered the boardroom, it was already half full. Dr. Richardson sat near the head of the table, speaking quietly with Dr. Langston and several other senior doctors. Their expressions darkened when they saw Noah and Emma, but neither spoke. Noah felt a cold surge of anger rise in his chest as he locked eyes with Richardson. This man had spent years blocking him and countless others, smirking his way through people's careers as if they were mere obstacles in his path. Today, it would end. The hospital administrator, a stiff, no-nonsense woman named Dr. Paige Monroe, entered the room with a sharpness that indicated this meeting would be direct and efficient. She took her seat at the head of the table, looking at the agenda in front of her. This meeting has been called to address recent concerns raised by senior staff regarding the conduct of Nurse Williams and Dr. Caldwell, she began, her tone clipped. There have been allegations of insubordination during a critical surgery, and today we will. Noah stepped forward, his voice cutting through the formal proceedings. Before we discuss those allegations, there's something we need to bring to the board's attention. Dr. Monroe glanced up, annoyed by the interruption. This meeting is to discuss the complaints against you, Mr. Williams. If you'll want to hear this, Noah said, holding her gaze. His calmness belied the storm brewing inside him. Emma stepped beside him, opening the folder in her hand. We have evidence of a systematic pattern of discrimination and obstruction in this hospital. Senior staff members, including Dr. Richardson, have been actively involved in blocking the promotion of minority staff for years. This isn't an isolated incident, it's been happening across the board. A murmur rippled through the room, eyes darting to Dr. Richardson, who sat stiffly, his face reddening with anger. He glanced toward Dr. Langston, his silent ally, but Langston's face remained impassive. Noah continued. We've collected records, emails, memos, and internal documents that show how a small group of senior doctors have been handpicking staff for leadership roles based on personal bias rather than merit. They've been actively working to keep minority nurses and doctors from moving up in this institution. Dr. Monroe's eyes narrowed as she listened, her attention now fully on Noah and Emma. You're accusing senior staff of deliberate discrimination? That's a serious claim, Mr. Williams. It's not just a claim, Emma said, stepping forward. It's documented. We have proof. She handed over the file, thick with papers outlining the internal corruption. The room went deadly silent as Dr. Monroe flipped through the documents, her expression tightening with each page. Dr. Richardson stood abruptly, his voice raised. This is ridiculous. They're trying to cover their own failures by fabricating some conspiracy against the hospital. I won't sit here and, Noah interrupted him, his voice steady but firm. You can deny it all you want, Richardson, but the evidence is right there. We've got the emails where you and Langston discuss blocking my promotion, discussing how diversity hires don't fit the hospital's image. Langston's face flushed, but he remained seated, unwilling to fully defend himself. Richardson, however, was far from done. You've always been a troublemaker, Williams, Richardson spat, his face twisted in fury. And now you're dragging this hospital down with your baseless accusations. Noah didn't flinch. This isn't about me anymore. This is about every nurse and doctor you've stepped on to protect your little empire. Dr. Monroe raised a hand, silencing the room. That's enough. We will review these documents thoroughly before making any decisions. But Noah wasn't finished. He turned toward the door, where the reporters had been waiting just out of sight. With a small nod from Emma, the reporters entered the room, cameras rolling. We thought you might want the public to be aware of this process, Emma said, her voice cold and sharp. The city deserves to know how its hospital is run. The room erupted into chaos as senior staff began shouting over one another, trying to protest the presence of the reporters. But Noah and Emma stood firm. This was no longer just about their careers, it was about accountability, about exposing a system that had harmed too many for too long. Dr. Monroe's eyes blazed with fury, but she was a pragmatic woman. She knew there was no stopping this now. The evidence was public. The board had no choice but to investigate. Noah felt the weight lift slightly from his shoulders. It wasn't over, not yet, but the truth was out. They had struck the blow that would shatter the walls Richardson and his allies had built around themselves. As the meeting dissolved into chaos, Noah glanced at Emma, who gave him a small, weary smile. They had done it, taken the first step in tearing down the corruption that had poisoned the hospital. But they both knew the fight wasn't over. The fallout would be swift and brutal. Careers would be destroyed, including possibly their own. But for the first time in a long time, Noah felt like they were finally on the right side of history. The fallout from the boardroom showdown was swift and explosive. Within hours of the meeting, the hospital was buzzing with whispers and rumors. By the next morning, the news had spread far beyond the walls of the hospital. The story of systemic discrimination, corruption, and professional sabotage made the headlines in the local papers, and the hospital administration was forced to launch a full investigation into Dr. Richardson and his network. Noah sat in his small apartment, scrolling through the news articles on his phone. The weight of the past week was still heavy on his shoulders, but now there was something else, something lighter, like the first hint of relief after a long storm. They had done it. The truth was out. Across the room, Emma sat at the table, her phone buzzing constantly with messages from colleagues, reporters, and friends. She had barely had a moment to breathe since the news broke, and Noah could see the exhaustion etched across her face. But there was a flicker of satisfaction in her eyes as well. How are you feeling? Noah asked, breaking the silence. Emma looked up from her phone, her expression softening. Tired, she admitted with a small laugh. But, hopeful. I didn't think we'd get this far. Noah nodded, understanding all too well. He hadn't expected the hospital to actually respond to their accusations, not with how deeply ingrained the corruption was. But with the media pressure and public scrutiny, there was no way for them to bury it this time. Dr. Monroe called earlier, Emma continued. She said the board has already suspended Richardson and Langston. They're launching a formal inquiry into all of their leadership decisions from the past 5 years. Noah's chest tightened at the thought. It was a victory, but it still felt surreal. And us? Emma shrugged. They're putting us under review, but I don't think they can touch us now. We've got too many eyes on this place. If they try to fire us, it'll just make things worse for them. Noah leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow breath. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time, he felt like they had some control over their future. The hospital was being forced to confront its problems, and he and Emma had started the fire that would burn through the system. But as much as he wanted to celebrate, Noah couldn't ignore the cost. He had seen the way some of his colleagues looked at him, the uncertainty, the doubt. Not everyone was happy about the upheaval. Some feared for their own positions, while others resented that two people had torn down a carefully constructed hierarchy. What happens now? Noah asked, more to himself than to Emma. Emma set her phone down and crossed the room to sit beside him. We keep fighting, she said quietly. There's still a lot to fix. The hospital isn't going to change overnight. But we've started something. That matters. Noah looked at her, his heart swelling with gratitude and admiration. They had gone through hell together, risking their careers, their reputations, everything. But they had stood by each other through it all. And now, there was a chance for something better. Dr. Monroe also mentioned something else, Emma said after a pause. She wants you to take on a leadership role. A formal position in the hospital's diversity committee, helping to lead the reforms. Noah blinked in surprise. Seriously? Emma nodded. She knows that they need someone who can actually drive change. Someone who understands what needs to be done. And that's you. For a moment, Noah didn't know what to say. The idea of taking on such a role felt overwhelming, but it also felt right. He had fought for this, for the chance to make things better not just for himself, but for others who had been silenced, overlooked, and mistreated. Maybe now he could finally make a real difference. Are you going to do it? Emma asked, her eyes searching his face. Noah thought about everything they had been through, the battles, the sacrifices, the pain. And then he thought about the future, the possibilities of what could be built from the ashes of the old system. Yeah, he said softly. I think I will. Emma smiled, her hand resting on his. Good. They need you, Noah. We need you. The warmth of her touch sent a wave of comfort through him, grounding him in the moment. For the first time in what felt like forever, Noah allowed himself to feel hopeful. The road ahead would be difficult, there were still battles to be fought, changes to be made. But they had proven that change was possible. They had proven that standing up, no matter the cost, was worth it. As they sat together, the city outside their window continued to move, the world carrying on. But for Noah, things had shifted. He wasn't the same person he had been when he first walked into that operating room, unsure of whether he could challenge Richardson. He had found his voice, and now he was ready to use it. A few days later, Noah found himself back at the hospital, walking the familiar halls with a different sense of purpose. The whispers still followed him, but they didn't sting like they used to. He knew that change took time, and he was prepared to face the resistance. As he entered the conference room for the first meeting of the newly formed diversity committee, Noah paused for a moment, taking it all in. The room was filled with staff, nurses, doctors, administrators, many of whom had quietly supported him and Emma in the background. He saw new faces, people who had been afraid to speak up before but were now ready to be part of the solution. Emma stood by the window, her eyes meeting his as he entered. She gave him a small nod, a signal that they were in this together, no matter what. Noah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. This was just the beginning, but he was ready. He had found his place, not just as a nurse, but as a leader, a voice for change. As the meeting began, Noah stood up to speak, his voice steady and sure. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his eyes sweeping across the room. "This is the start of something new. Something better." And with that, Noah Williams, once a nurse fighting to be heard, became the catalyst for a revolution in healthcare, one that would resonate far beyond the walls of this hospital.